The activist movements in New Zealand through the 1980s helped spark the change needed for our nuclear-free stance. With protests such as those that happened with the Rainbow Warrior, New Zealand was able to stand for smaller Pacific nations.
In a way, in the 80s, and particularly under David Robie, New Zealand was standing up for that right of a small nation to basically stand up to the big countries.
That movement came from a very solid activist base that had been well experienced, I'm talking New Zealand here, with respect to the Vietnam protests against the Vietnam War, of course. And so there was a culture that had developed of resistance to ideas that were considered to be draconian, authoritarian, etc., etc. So the environment in New Zealand was right.
What pushed New Zealand in the direction it did with the nuclear-free approach and so on was the massive activism of just ordinary people getting out on the boats in Auckland Harbour, for example, or Wellington Harbour, out in the street, people rising up and saying, look, we don't want this, we want to be independent, we want to have our voice.
We had politicians who were concerned, people like David Robie, who was leading the charge, with a huge amount of support in behind him from ordinary New Zealanders. And so the whole thing was one environment, a pressure cooker if you like, and it all came to a head with the Rainbow Warrior bombing.
Manning says the Rainbow Warrior bombing in 1985 brought the nation to stand together.
What it did was it galvanised the resolve of the whole country to fight back against this, and certainly politically for that idea to be entrenched in our legislation.
We saw this as a terrible affront on our sovereignty and on our nation. How could a friendly country like France have the audacity to do such an outrage against a peaceful environmental ship?
But in today's political environment, does this sort of activism still exist?
Well, I'm not sure about the passion that was there before, and it was very evident for a good 20 years or so. There is actually quite a bit of lobbying going on, and I think a certain amount of revival of these issues.
So if you compare to now, I think what we see here is obviously a more fragmented activist movement, but also a sophistication of communicating. But that doesn't mean that the purpose is not there to actually resist.
And Robie says there is a new focus for protest in the Pacific.
But I think a lot of people campaigning in the region have now become a lot more focused on issues such as climate change. Look what happened with Newcastle, for example, the blockade by the Pacific protesters on the coal port in Newcastle. Those are the sorts of things that are happening more and more, and so we are seeing something of a revival of people activism.
But the challenge is getting these messages through to mainstream media.
In Australia, for example, a lot of the major media organisations, the Rupert Murdoch's Australian and the News Limited group, for example, really take a role of virtually supporting the climate change deniers. And I feel today that the media is far too close to the seats of power, and we've actually sometimes we've lost sight of what our role is, which is about being an extension of people's rights and giving ordinary people a go. We seem to think that our role is to extension of power and a continuation of the power elites. We've got it wrong.
Independent filmmaker Philip Shingler says keeping the interest for issues in the Pacific can be a problem.
It's not as high on the agenda as it used to be 20, 25 years ago. It's very interesting that in television, that commissioning editors who commission programs have said to me quite often, well, we've done the Pacific this year. And I say, but this is a third of the planet. And so the view from the Northern Hemisphere, and I'm speaking now from Europe, is that the Pacific is a long way away in the Southern Hemisphere, right? And the issues are kind of out of sight over the horizon.
Everybody can see it around them all the time. We see the evidence from week to week, month to month, of all the signs of global warming and climate change. So there's the big challenge now for the media to face up to this and not just treat it as another round.
But Robie says the people need to play their part too.
Because what is really at stake is sovereignty, about our right, not just New Zealand's right, but the right of Pacific nations, small Pacific nations, to have their voice and to be heard.
If activist movements pitch themselves right, there's an environment still that remains very, very, very powerful for an activism movement to get its messages across and get a better world happening for our futures.
Nuclear powers in the Pacific bring concerns for militarisation in the area.
Having the military presence in overseas territories like New Caledonia, in spite of the local powers that they now have of the government, same with French Polynesia, it's really important for French forces to have places where they're based. But compared with the height of the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement, which was really through into the 80s, probably it really waned after the ending of nuclear tests by France. But the realities are still actually very, very important.
We cannot take our eye off the issues relating to nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, as they say, though they are still there.
And at the height of nuclear testing, the Rainbow Warrior was only a part of a bigger picture.
When France started to ratchet up its nuclear testing in the Pacific, there had already been a couple of decades of testing in different areas, and certainly in certain parts of the Pacific as well. And people knew the consequence of testing, so that you knew that women were having jellyfish babies, it was awful things.
But we have to put it in the context of the time. And there was all sorts of repression going on in the Pacific. And I think of mostly New Caledonia at that time, because there was a huge garrison of French troops in the mid-80s at the time of the Rainbow Warrior bombing, to keep the lid on Kanak people demanding their independence. So when you put that into the context of what happened to the Rainbow Warrior, it was a reflection of this madness in Paris about a very hard line approach, and it was going to sort of stop independence at any cost, and it was going to hang on to the right to carry on nuclear tests in Mororua.
But now the future becomes a matter of our international relations with the bigger players. Manning says our policies have changed from being an independent Pacific Island state.
We are no longer independent. We are very much into the frame of the Five Eyes intelligence network. That brings a responsibility to not only the United States' external interests, but also Britain, Canada and Australia.
Now we have rivalry between China and the United States and the Pacific, both currying for favour in terms of aid and so on, and one does something and the other one's got to sort of compete for influence in the region.
Future relations with major countries like China and the US may prove difficult for New Zealand.
Relating to security and defence and military matters, it's caused a tension between New Zealand on one side engaging with the United States and a tension engaging with China.
And Manning says New Zealand can't hold its position, and decisions need to be made in the next few years regarding our current situation. Alice Takata for Pacific Media Watch.